The dust of Red Mesa was a living thing. It was the color of a fresh wound and fine as flour. And on that spring festival morning, the wind lifted it in lazy sheets that painted the sky a pale, hazy pink. It settled on the brim of every hat, coated the clapboard fronts of the general store and the dustpan saloon, and left a gritty film on a man's teeth. Today, it was confetti for a celebration nobody had asked for. Eliza Hart sat on a hard-backed chair on the hastily built platform in front of Blackstone and Company Bank, a place that dealt in paper and promises. Two things she had learned were the same as dust. Next to her, her mother Martha worried a loose thread on her glove, her face tight with a smile that did not reach her eyes. On the other side sat her father, Silas, his big farmer's hands resting on his knees, looking straight ahead as if he were judging the quality of a horizon. But his eyes were fixed on Victor Blackstone, who stood at the center of the platform, beaming like a man who had just discovered water on land he'd bought for a song. "Welcome, citizens of Red Mesa," Victor's voice boomed, a rich, oiled sound that seemed to push the dust away. A glorious day for our territory, a day for new beginnings. Down below, the town had gathered, ranch hands, homesteaders, the blacksmith still smelling of coal smoke, and even Inez from the saloon, leaning against a post with her arms crossed, a look of wry amusement on her face. And lined up before the platform, shuffling their feet in the red dirt, were the new beginnings. 12 of them. An assortment of young men, scrubbed and slicked, their faces a mixture of hope and raw greed. Eliza looked at them, one by one. They were not men. Not really. They were exhibits. There was a rancher's son with a chest puffed out so far it was a wonder he could breathe. Next to him, a clerk from the land office who looked as if a strong wind would send him tumbling back to whatever ledger he'd crawled out of. And at the end of the line, standing a little apart as if the conclusion were already foregone, was Warren Blackstone, Victor's son. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, impossibly clean in the swirling dust, and his smile was a small, perfect copy of his father's. Her gaze drifted past them, over the heads of the crowd, searching for something real. It found him in front of the general store. He was not watching the spectacle. His back was to the platform, his attention fully on a length of new rope he held in his hands. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who worked more than he ate. He wore a plain shirt, the fabric worn soft, and his hat was stained with the honest sweat of labor. He coiled the rope, tested its weight, his movements economical and sure. He was not part of the show. He was part of the world. Eliza did not know his name, but she knew the set of his shoulders. She had seen him around, taking odd jobs, always quiet, always working. He moved like a man who did not waste a single motion or a single word. "First, let us hear from young Jedediah Ingram," Victor announced, gesturing to the puffed-up rancher's son. Jedediah stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Blackstone, Mr. Hart, ma'am." He nodded at Eliza's mother, then gave Eliza a look he must have thought was charming. "I offer for your daughter's hand my prize bull, Samson, who sires the strongest calves in this territory, and with him, the deed to 160 acres of prime grazing land, bordering the Hart Ranch." A murmur went through the crowd. A good offer, solid, tangible. Silas Hart nodded slowly, a calculated measure of approval. Eliza felt nothing. She had seen Samson the bull, a sad, lumbering beast, bred for nothing but his own utility. She felt a certain kinship with him. The clerk from the land office went next, his voice thin and reedy. He did not offer bulls or land, but a portfolio of mining shares and a promise of a directorship on the new railroad spur. He spoke of futures and dividends, words as flimsy as smoke. After him came a merchant's boy who presented a string of pearls in a velvet box. The pearls were milky and lifeless. They looked like the eyes of a dead fish. Eliza watched them all, her face a placid mask. Inside, something cold and hard was turning over. This was not so different from 2 years ago. The memory came unbidden, not as a story, but as a feeling, a taste of metallic fear and the rough scrape of a burlap sack against her cheek. She had been taken then, a pawn in one of her father's business disputes. The men who took her had talked about her value, what she might fetch, as if she were a head of cattle. They had promised her father would pay, that power and money would decide her fate. But they had been wrong. Her father's money had not saved her. His influence had not reached the abandoned line shack where they'd kept her. She had saved herself. One night, when one was drunk and the other asleep, she had worked the ropes loose from her wrists, slipped a knife from the sleeping one's belt, and run. She ran until her lungs burned and her feet were raw, following the stars back toward a home that no longer felt safe. When she stumbled back into Red Mesa, covered in dust and blood, a ghost in the dawn. She was not the same girl who had left. The girl who believed in promises, who trusted in the protection of powerful men, had died out there in the scrubland. In her place was a young woman who believed only in the heft of a knife, the certainty of a step, and the cold, hard truth of a bucket of well water. Promises were just air. Power was a cage. Warren Blackstone was the last to step forward. He did not address Eliza at all. He spoke to her father and his own, a conversation between equals finalizing a transaction. Father, Mr. Hart, the union of our families would be a formidable thing. The Blackstone Bank and the Heartlands, merged, would control the future of this valley. My offer is not a bull, nor a piece of paper. My offer is the future itself. He finally turned his gaze on Eliza, and his smile was the click of a lock, and my undying affection. Of course. The crowd clapped. A polite, inevitable sound. Victor Blackstone raised his hands for silence, his face glowing with triumph. It was all going according to his grand design. Eliza saw it all with a terrible clarity. The festival, the suitors, the public spectacle, it was all stagecraft, designed to make this moment look like a choice, a romance. But it was a foreclosure. Victor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to his son, not to her father. He nodded toward the side of the platform, where Deputy Harlan Pike stood, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Pike, who always had a greasy shine on his face and whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. Victor Blackstone had bid highest for years. The deputy stepped forward, a folded document in his hand. He did not look at Eliza, but at her father. Silas Hart refused to meet her eyes. Just a formality, Victor said smoothly to the crowd. In light of Miss Hart's delicate constitution since her unfortunate ordeal 2 years ago, her father, Silas Hart, has seen fit to petition the territorial court for her own protection. You understand? Pike unfolded the paper. Eliza could not read the words from where she sat, but she did not need to. She saw the heavy official script. She saw the words guardianship and instability. A cold dread, colder than the fear in the line shack, washed over her. This was not a marriage proposal. This was an ownership transfer. They were not asking for her hand. They were declaring her unfit to have a will of her own. With that piece of paper, she would cease to be Eliza Hart, a person. She would become a ward, a possession, a column in a ledger, passed from her father's control to the Blackstone estate through marriage to Warren, an asset. Like the prize bull, Samson, the air left her lungs. For a moment, she was back in the dark, the ropes tight on her wrists, the world shrinking to the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. They were tying her up again, but this time with paper and ink, with the law as their rope. The crowd murmured, confused. Her mother finally looked at her, her eyes pleading. Pleading for what? For her to be quiet, to be good, to walk gracefully into the cage they had built for her. Something inside Eliza, the part of her that had run through the night with bare, bleeding feet, snapped slowly, deliberately. She stood up. The scraping of her chair legs on the raw pine boards was unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. Her mother gasped. Her father's head jerked toward her, his face a mask of shock and anger. Victor Blackstone's smile faltered. Eliza did not look at any of them. She looked out at the red dust, at the solid, unyielding line of the horizon. She took a breath. It tasted like freedom. She stepped off the platform, her simple leather shoes making a soft thud in the dirt. She did not stumble. Her head was high. She walked straight toward the line of stunned suitors. Jedediah Ingram took an involuntary step back. The clerk with the mining shares looked as if he might faint. Warren's face was a picture of disbelief, his perfect smile curdling into an ugly sneer. She walked right through the middle of them, parting them like a boat through still water. She did not spare them a glance. They were ghosts. Their promises were dust. Her path was a straight line, away from the lies and the paper contracts, across the wide, dusty street. The crowd parted for her, their faces a sea of open mouths and wide eyes. She walked toward the man with the rope. He had finally turned, drawn by the silence. He watched her approach, his eyes a calm, steady gray. They took in the whole scene in a single, sweeping glance, her resolute walk, the fury on Victor Blackstone's face, the official paper still in the deputy's hand, the confused shame on her father's face. He saw it all, and understood it in a way no one else there did. He saw the trap and the animal caught in it. Eliza stopped a foot in front of him. The scent of clean sweat, leather, and dust rose from him. It was the most honest smell in the world. She did not know if he would help her. She did not know if he would laugh, or turn her away, or simply step aside and let the posse that would surely follow drag her back. She only knew that he was the truest thing in this whole sorry town, and she had to choose truth. She held out her hand. It was steady. "I choose you," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent street. The man, Cole Ashford, looked at her outstretched hand. He looked into her eyes, and for a long moment he said nothing. He saw not a prize to be won, but a person making a desperate, last stand. He saw the steel beneath the fear. He glanced back at the platform, at the gathering storm of Blackstone's rage and Pike's swagger. He was a man who avoided trouble, but he was also a man who knew injustice when he saw it. This was not about romance. This was about a rescue. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He did not take her hand. Instead, his voice, low and calm, cut through the tension. "Let's go." Action followed the word, swift and without ceremony. Cole turned and strode toward a sturdy roan tied to the hitching post. He did not look back to see if Eliza was following. His stride was an assumption, a command more potent than any shout. Eliza moved, her legs feeling strangely light, as if they belonged to someone else. The stunned silence of the crowd was a physical pressure, a thick blanket she had to push through. A roar of fury erupted from the platform behind her. Victor Blackstone was shouting her name, then her father's, his voice cracking with disbelief. Cole swung into the saddle in one fluid motion. He reached down, not a gentleman's offered hand, but a grip meant for hauling. "Up," he said. The single word was all the instruction she got. She placed her dusty shoe onto his booted foot in the stirrup and reached, his hand closing around her forearm with a strength that was startling but steady. He pulled her up, settling her sideways in front of him. It was awkward. Her skirts bunching around her legs, the hard muscle of his thigh a solid reality against her. The horse shifted, its hide warm and smelling of dust and animal sweat. He did not bolt. With a calm click of his tongue, he urged the roan into a steady walk, aiming not for the open road out of town, but for the general store. The crowd, which had been a frozen tableau, now broke into a confused babble. Deputy Pike, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, started forward, his hand going to his gun. "Hold on there! Ashford!" Pike yelled, his voice more bluster than authority. "That's Silas Hart's daughter you've got there!" Cole did not stop. He reined in the horse in front of the store, its wooden porch groaning. From her perch in the saloon doorway, Inez watched, a thin smile playing on her lips. As a few of Warren's friends made to follow Pike, she stepped forward just enough to block their path. "Now, boys," she said, her voice low and carrying, "don't go ruining the best entertainment we've had since the last dust storm. Let's see how this picture plays out." She nudged the man closest to her, a burly ranch hand. "Besides, Pike looks like he's got it handled, doesn't he?" The men paused, glancing from the fuming deputy to Inez's knowing expression. They were not brave men, merely loud ones, and the idea of this being a show rather than a fight was appealing. They hesitated, and that was all it took. Cole slid from the saddle, leaving Eliza on the horse. "Stay put," he said. The words a soft rumble meant only for her. He took the store's 3 steps in a single stride and disappeared inside, through the grimy window. Eliza could see him moving with purpose. He pointed at a sack of flour, a slab of salt pork hanging from a hook, a tin of coffee. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Peterson, scurried to gather the items. Deputy Pike had reached the horse now, puffing slightly. He glared up at Eliza. "Miss Hart, you get down from there this instant. Your father demands it." Eliza looked down at his shiny, sweating face. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire of her decision. "I do not think so. Deputy," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. Cole reappeared at the doorway, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He tossed a few coins onto the counter, far more than the cost of the goods. Peterson's eyes went wide. Cole met the storekeeper's gaze for a second, a silent transaction that had nothing to do with money. It was a payment for silence, for time. Then he was back on the porch. He ignored Pike completely, walking to the roan and tying the sack securely behind the saddle. "That's far enough. Ashford," Pike repeated, his hand now gripping his pistol. "I am placing you under arrest for kidnapping." Cole finally turned to face him. He did not seem impressed. He simply looked at the deputy, his gray eyes unblinking. He was not a large man, not like Silas Hart or the blacksmith, but there was a density to him, a stillness that suggested deep roots. "She came of her own free will," Cole stated. It was not a defense. It was a fact. "She is not in her right mind. We have a paper says so." "A paper is a paper," Cole said, and the simple truth of it hung in the air. He turned his back on the deputy again and mounted the horse, his movements economical and unhurried. He settled in behind Eliza, his presence a solid wall at her back. He gathered the reins, and this time, he nudged the roan into a canter. They moved past the saloon, past the blacksmith's, toward the edge of town. Pike shouted after them, but he did not draw his weapon. The town's sheriff, a man who preferred a quiet life, had emerged from his office and was watching with a thoughtful expression, making no move to intervene. No one else moved either. The town of Red Mesa simply watched them go. A woman who had refused to be sold and the quiet stranger who had helped her. They rode out of the dust cloud of the town and into the vast, open land. The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged line of the western mountains, painting the sky in strokes of orange and deep purple. The world grew quiet. The only sounds, the rhythmic thud of the roan's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the soft creak of saddle leather. The wind picked up, cool against Eliza's flushed cheeks, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. She was acutely aware of the man behind her. His chest was a warm, solid presence against her back. His arms were on either side of her, his hands steady on the reins. He did not speak, and she was grateful for the silence. There were no words for what had happened, for the chasm she had just crossed. The silence was a balm, a space to simply be, to feel the motion of the horse carrying her away from a life that had become a prison. They rode on as the light faded, the landscape transforming into a world of deep shadows and stark silhouettes. The red mesas burned a final, fiery crimson before turning a deep, bruised purple. Stars began to prick the darkening velvet of the sky, more stars than she had ever seen from her bedroom window, bright and cold and impossibly distant. The air grew sharp with the desert cold, and she shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Cole guided the horse off the main track, following a barely visible trail that wound its way into a narrow valley walled by tall stone cliffs. The horse's hooves clicked on loose rock. The moon had risen, a pale sliver, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar shapes of yucca and creosote look like strange, watching creatures. After what felt like hours, he finally drew the horse to a halt. Ahead, tucked against the base of a cliff, was a dark shape, a small, abandoned line shack, its roofline sagging but its stone walls looking solid enough. It was little more than a hovel, a temporary shelter for cowboys riding the line, long since forgotten. Cole dismounted and then reached up for her. His hands went to her waist, and he lifted her down as easily as if she were a child. Her legs were stiff and shaky when they touched the ground. For a moment, she had to place a hand on the horse's warm flank to steady herself. He said nothing, simply set about unsaddling the roan, his movements efficient in the dim light. He rubbed the horse down with a practiced hand, murmuring soft words to it, before hobbling it in a patch of sparse grass. Eliza stood by, feeling useless, a spectator in her own escape. The silence was no longer just a space to breathe. It was a question. What now? When he was done, he picked up the sack of supplies and gestured with his head toward the shack. The door hung crookedly on one hinge, opening into a single, dark room. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, pack rats, and old ashes. A rough stone fireplace stood against one wall, and a simple wooden cot with a tattered blanket was pushed into a corner. That was all. Cole dropped the sack on the floor with a thud. He found the stub of a candle and a tin of matches on the mantelpiece, and soon had a small, flickering light pushing back the shadows. He did not look at her. He seemed to be giving her space, letting her acclimate to the stark reality of their new surroundings. This was not a grand adventure. This was survival. The first rays of dawn were just touching the tops of the cliffs when Eliza woke. She had slept fitfully on the hard-packed dirt floor near the hearth, wrapped in her shawl. Sometime during the night, Cole had laid the tattered blanket from the cot over her. He was already outside. She could hear the rhythmic, metallic squeak of a hand pump. She sat up, her body aching from the long ride. The shack looked even more forlorn in the gray morning light. Dust lay thick on every surface. She got to her feet and went to the doorway. Cole was at an old well a few yards from the shack, working the long iron handle of the pump. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms. With each pull, water gushed from the spout into a rusty bucket. He worked with a steady, untiring rhythm. When the bucket was full, he carried it over and set it down near the door. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the morning light. "There is a broom inside," he said. His voice was gravelly with sleep, and an empty bucket. It was not a command. It was a statement of fact, an offering of purpose. He was going to light a fire. There was dust to be swept. There was water to be fetched. This was the language of their new life. Eliza nodded and went back inside. She found the worn-down broom and began to sweep, the simple, repetitive motion a comfort. She swept away the old dust, the leavings of strangers, the neglect. With each stroke, The room felt a little more like a place where someone could live, and a little less like a place where someone had given up. When she finished, Cole had coaxed a small fire to life in the hearth, and the smell of coffee was beginning to fill the small space. He had laid out the salt pork and a tin plate. He looked from the cot in the corner to the space she had cleared by the fire. "You can have the cot," he said quietly, "or the floor by the fire, whichever you prefer." The words were simple, but they struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. Whichever you prefer. It was the first real choice anyone had offered her in 2 years. Not a false choice between 12 suitors, but a genuine question about her own comfort, her own will. She looked at the lumpy cot, then at the warmth of the fire. "The fire is fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, accepting her decision without comment. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. It was black and bitter and wonderful. After they had eaten, a silent meal of salt pork fried over the fire. Eliza picked up the second bucket. It was lighter than the one Cole had used, and just as rusty. She walked to the well, the morning air cool and clean on her skin. The iron handle of the pump was cold beneath her hands. She started to work it, mimicking the steady rhythm she had watched Cole use. It was harder than it looked. Her arms and back protested. The squeak of the pump was a lonely sound in the vast silence of the valley, but she kept at it, putting her whole body into the task. Slowly, gush by gush, the water level in the bucket began to rise. Clear, cold water, drawn up from the deep earth by the labor of her own hands. Finally, it was full, the water sloshing over the rim as she gave one last pump. She set the handle down and looked at her prize. The morning sun had cleared the cliffs now, and a single beam of light struck the bucket, making the water glitter as if it were filled with diamonds. It was just a bucket of water. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was the first thing she had ever truly owned, because she had earned it. This was real. This was hers. A choice, an action, a result. She stood there for a long time, just looking at the full bucket, the weight of it a solid and reassuring promise in the quiet morning. The days settled into a rhythm, dictated not by a clock but by the sun and the needs of survival. Their life was a litany of labor. It began before dawn with the groan and squeak of the well pump, a duet they performed without speaking. Cole's turn would fill the large bucket for the horse and for washing. Eliza's would fill the smaller one for drinking and cooking. At first, her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and the smooth covers of books, blistered. The raw skin stung with every pull of the cold iron handle. Cole never offered to do her share. Instead, one evening, he silently handed her a pair of worn leather gloves, the fingers too long. The palms softened with another person's work. She wore them, and the blisters turned to calluses, hard little shields of resilience on her palms. Her hands were becoming the hands of the woman who lived here, not the girl who had fled Red Mesa. Her world, once defined by 4 walls and her father's expectations, shrank and expanded at the same time. It shrank to the confines of this small stone shack and the surrounding valley, but it expanded to encompass the real and vital tasks of living. She learned the satisfying thud of an axe biting into dry wood. Cole would split the larger logs, his movements a study in controlled power, and she would chop the smaller pieces for kindling. He taught her how to sharpen the axe head with a whetstone, showing her the precise angle, the patient, circular motion. He did not use many words, only like this, and guided her hands once. After that, she was expected to know, and she did. While she managed the small circle of their domesticity, mending the thin blanket and the tear in her dress with thread, she unraveled from the hem of her petticoat. Cole ranged farther. He would leave at dawn with a handful of snares and return in the afternoon with a rabbit or 2, which they would cook in the single cast-iron skillet over the fire. Their meals were silent affairs, each focused on the food, the taste of meat and salt a luxury. They ate from the skillet, a simple intimacy born of necessity. There was no room for ceremony here. There was only work. and the results of that work. He spent an entire afternoon repairing a broken strap on his saddle, his head bent, his fingers surprisingly nimble with the awl and waxed thread. Language between them was action. A sharpened axe was a conversation. A mended shirt was a reply. A shared meal was a treaty. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of the sun across the vast, empty sky. The heat was a constant pressure, baking the earth until it cracked. The air was so dry it seemed to steal the moisture from your skin. Then one afternoon, the world changed. The relentless blue of the sky began to bruise at the edges, turning a deep, ominous purple. The wind, usually a hot, dusty breath, shifted, carrying a scent she had never known before, a smell of damp earth and something green and resinous. Cole stopped what he was doing, standing still and lifting his head to the wind like an animal. "Creosote," he said, more to himself than to her. "Rain is coming." It was the first time he had named the world for her. She looked at the scrubby, dark green bushes that dotted the valley and understood they were not just part of the landscape. They were messengers. They learned to read the sky together that afternoon. He pointed to a high, thin streak of violet cloud clinging to the mountaintops. "When you see that," he said, his voice low, "get to high ground. That means water is coming down the washes. A flash flood. It will not wait for you." The rain did not come in a gentle shower. The sky opened, and a deluge fell. A solid sheet of water that turned the red dust to thick, running mud in minutes. It hammered on the shack's flimsy roof, finding every crack and hole, and soon a dozen tiny streams were trickling down the inside of the stone walls. The sound was deafening, a roar that shut out the world. They worked together, moving their few supplies to the driest part of the room, using the skillet to catch the worst of the drips. The storm lasted for hours. As dusk fell, the rain softened to a steady, drumming rhythm. The air was blessedly cool and clean. Cole stood on the small, covered porch, little more than a roof overhang, watching the water run in rivulets through the thirsty land. The intensity of the day, the hard labor and the sudden violence of the storm had worn him down. Eliza could see it in the slump of his shoulders. He leaned against a post, his hat tipped low, and the steady sound of the rain seemed to mesmerize him. Eliza sat inside, watching his silhouette against the gray, wet twilight. She felt a strange new emotion, a protective instinct for this quiet, self-contained man who had asked for nothing from her, not even her story. He had simply made a space for her to exist. She saw his head nod once. Then again, he had fallen asleep on his feet, worn out by the world. Quietly, she took the sheepskin he used for a bedroll and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold now, a damp chill that went straight to the bone. He did not stir as she approached, carefully so as not to wake him. She draped the heavy, soft wool over his shoulders. It was an awkward gesture. She had never touched him voluntarily before. The scent of him, of leather and wood smoke and rain, rose from the fabric. As she stepped back, his eyes opened. In the dim light, she could not read their expression, but they were fixed on her. He was not startled. He was just watching her. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. She thought he would be angry, that she had crossed some unspoken line. "Thank you," he said. The two words were quiet, almost lost in the sound of the rain. But they landed in the space between them with the weight of a sacred oath. It was an acceptance, an acknowledgement. It was the first crack in the wall of silence he lived behind, the first door creaking open. Eliza simply nodded, her throat tight, and retreated back into the relative dryness of the shack, her heart beating a little faster. In the days that followed, something had shifted. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was less the silence of strangers and more the comfortable quiet of companions. They fell back into their rhythm of work. But now there was a new awareness, a thread of connection woven through the mundane tasks. One morning, while gathering firewood near the base of the cliffs, Eliza saw it. A splash of impossible color against the red rock and gray-green brush. A cluster of Indian paintbrush, their scarlet tips like flames licking up from the dry earth. They were so vibrant, so defiantly beautiful in this harsh, unforgiving land. She carefully picked a single stalk. It felt fragile and alive in her calloused hand. She did not know why she did it. It was an impulse, a small act of beauty in a world that had been stripped down to pure function. When she returned to the shack, Cole was at the well. She placed the single, brilliant red flower on the rough-hewn log that served as their doorstep and went inside to start the coffee. It was a silent offering, a splash of color to greet the day. When he came in with the water, he did not mention it. He did not look at it, but she noticed that he stepped carefully over the log, so as not to disturb it. The next morning, she left another, and the morning after that, it became her own silent ritual. Her way of speaking the language of beauty he had begun to teach her with his knowledge of the clouds and the creosote. For a week, the flowers appeared, and for a week, they were seemingly ignored, left to wilt in the sun on the doorstep. Eliza began to feel foolish, a child leaving pebbles for fairies. Perhaps he saw it as a frivolous waste of time. Then, one evening, she was looking for a rag to clean the skillet and opened an old wooden box where Cole kept his few personal possessions. Inside, alongside a whetstone, a small knife, and a few coins, was a worn, leather-bound book. It looked like a ledger of some kind. Curious. She lifted the cover. The pages were filled with columns of names and numbers, records of old jobs, of debts owed and paid. It was the accounting of a hard, solitary life. And there, pressed carefully between two pages, was the first Indian paintbrush she had picked. And a few pages later, the second and the third. Each one was carefully preserved, a line of scarlet ink drawn across the grim ledger of his past. He had not ignored them at all. He had been saving them. He was replacing the bitter accounts of what the world had taken from him with the simple, beautiful gifts she had given. Eliza closed the book gently, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. In the quiet of the stone shack, surrounded by a world of dust and rock, something delicate and hopeful had taken root. Peace is a fragile thing in a hard country, as easily shattered as a thin skin of ice on a morning water trough. For weeks, the silence of the valley had been their shield, a quiet pact with the land itself, but the world beyond the valley had not forgotten them. And news, like water, always finds a way to trickle into the driest of places. It began as a smudge of dust on the far horizon, a sign that meant riders were coming, and coming fast. Cole saw it first. He was on the roof of the shack, patching a hole with mud and grass, and he went utterly still. Eliza, scrubbing the skillet by the door, felt the change in the air before she saw the cause. She followed his gaze and saw the dust cloud, an angry red bloom against the pale blue sky. It was not the lazy plume of a lone rider. This was the purposeful dust of 3 horses, moving with an urgency that spoke of trouble. She stood, wiping her wet hands on her skirt, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. Cole climbed down from the roof, his movements unhurried but deliberate. He did not reach for the rifle that leaned just inside the door. He simply stood beside her, his presence a solid, grounding thing. And they waited. They did not have to wait long. The riders crested the low rise at the mouth of the valley and came on, their forms taking shape out of the haze. The man in the lead was Warren Blackstone, even from a distance. There was no mistaking his straight-backed posture, the expensive cut of his coat. He rode a fine black horse that looked as out of place in this rugged landscape as he did. Flanking him were 2 men Eliza did not recognize, hard-faced men with guns tied low on their hips. They were not ranchers or townsfolk. They were the kind of men who were hired for jobs that other men would not do. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the shack, the animals snorting and stamping, kicking up fresh dust. Warren's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the scene: the patched roof, the line of laundry flapping in the breeze, the crude lean-to they had built for the roan. His lip curled in a faint sneer. "Well, well," Warren said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a voice made for parlors and boardrooms, thin and sharp. "Look at the little homesteaders, playing house." Eliza felt a hot flush of anger and shame. She stood straighter, lifting her chin. Cole remained motionless beside her, his face a mask of neutrality. He was a wall, and she was grateful to stand in its shadow. Warren swung down from his horse, his polished boots sinking into the dirt. He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve with an air of profound irritation. "I have come to take you home. Eliza, this foolishness has gone on long enough. Your father is worried sick." "My father knows where I am," Eliza said, her voice steady. "He has chosen not to come himself." Warren's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Your father is a busy man. He has entrusted me with your welfare. And with this," he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, the same kind of official-looking document Deputy Pike had held. "This is a warrant, issued by the territorial judge. It names me as your temporary guardian, pending a formal hearing on your mental fitness. It gives me the legal right to remove you from this situation. And it names this man," he gestured dismissively toward Cole, "as your abductor." "I was not abducted," Eliza said, her voice rising slightly. "I chose to leave." "A choice made by a troubled mind holds no weight in the eyes of the law," Warren said smoothly. "You have been through a terrible trauma. You are not yourself. We all understand that. We only want to help you." His words were slick with false sympathy, each one an insult. He was turning her own history into a weapon against her, declaring her a broken thing that needed to be managed. He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her worn dress, her calloused hands. "Look at you, living in filth with a hired hand. Have you no pride? Did he entice you with promises? What could a man like him possibly offer a woman like you?" Cole did not move a muscle. He did not speak. He simply watched Warren, his gray eyes as flat and hard as river stones. His silence was more potent than any threat. It unnerved Warren, who was used to men who blustered or cowered. "You—" "Ashford," Warren spat, finally addressing Cole directly. "You will release her into my custody immediately, or you will be arrested for kidnapping and horse theft. You will hang." Cole's voice, when it came, was quiet, devoid of any emotion. "The horse is mine, and the lady is not a prisoner." Warren laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The lady is a commodity her father has already promised to me. You are nothing but a thief who has stolen something that does not belong to him. You will be dealt with." He turned his back on Cole, a gesture of ultimate contempt. He looked at Eliza one last time. "I will be back, Eliza, with the sheriff, and with enough men to drag him out of here in chains. And you will come home. You will be my wife. That is the law." He mounted his horse, wheeled it around, and with a final, hateful glare, rode away. His two hired guns lingered for a moment, their eyes cold and challenging, before they turned and followed him. The dust of their departure hung in the air long after they were gone, a bitter taste in the back of the throat. The silence they left behind was heavy and poisoned. The peace of the valley was gone. Eliza stood trembling, not with fear, but with a deep, consuming rage. They were still trying to put a price on her, to write her story on a piece of paper. Cole finally moved. He walked to the woodpile and picked up the axe. He placed a log on the chopping block and swung, the blade sinking deep into the wood with a solid, satisfying crack. He swung again and again, the rhythmic violence a release for the tension that coiled between them. He did not speak of what had happened. There was nothing to say. The threat was as real and as tangible as the axe in his hands. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of returning riders. Eliza lay by the hearth, staring into the dying embers, her mind replaying Warren's smug, cruel face. Cole was a dark shape on the cot across the room, but she knew he was not asleep either. The stillness from his corner was too absolute, too watchful. It was hours later, in the deep, moonless dark that comes just before dawn, when she was finally drifting into a restless sleep, that the world exploded into chaos. It started with a sound, a high, terrified whinny from the roan that was not a sound of greeting or complaint, but a raw scream of animal terror. Cole was off the cot and moving before Eliza's eyes were fully open. The night air was suddenly thick with a sharp, choking smell of smoke. She scrambled to her feet and looked out the open doorway. The lean-to, their makeshift stable, was engulfed in flames. A hungry orange beast was devouring the dry timber and hay, spitting sparks into the black sky. Trapped inside, silhouetted against the fire, the roan was rearing and pulling against its rope, its eyes wide with panic. "The bucket?" Cole yelled, his voice tight with urgency. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice to her. He was already at the well, pumping the handle with frantic energy. Eliza grabbed the bucket and ran to the trough where the horse drank. Scooping up what little water was there, she threw it at the base of the lean-to, a useless, hissing gesture against the inferno. Cole ran past her with the full bucket, dousing the blanket from his cot. He did not try to fight the fire. It was too late for that. He was going for the horse. "No!" Eliza cried, grabbing for his arm. "Cole, do not go in there!" He shook her off, his face grim and set in the flickering firelight. "He will burn." He wrapped the soaking wet blanket around his head and shoulders and plunged into the smoke and flames. Eliza could only watch, her hand pressed to her mouth, her heart seizing with a fear more profound than any she had ever known. She heard the horse screaming, the crackle and roar of the fire, and Cole's voice, shouting, trying to calm the terrified animal. A moment later, which stretched into an eternity, he stumbled back out of the collapsing structure, pulling the frantic horse behind him. He had managed to cut the lead rope. The roan, its coat singed and smoking, galloped a short distance away and stood trembling, its sides heaving. Cole stood for a second, silhouetted against the blazing ruin, before he sank to one knee, coughing, pulling the blanket away from his face. The fire illuminated him, and Eliza saw it. His left hand, he was holding it cradled against his chest. The sleeve of his shirt was burned away, and the skin of his hand and forearm was an angry, blistered red. The flesh in some places peeled back and eerily white. He must have grabbed a burning beam to free the horse. The carefully constructed wall around Eliza's heart crumbled. In that moment, the loss of the shelter, the threat from Warren, the fear of being dragged back to Red Mesa, all of it vanished. All that existed was the man on his knees in the dirt, the smell of burned cloth and flesh, and the terrible, silent sight of his pain. A sob broke from her, a raw, ragged sound. She ran to him, the tears she had refused to shed for herself, for her own fear and humiliation, now streamed down her face. Hot and unchecked. She was not crying for the life they were losing, but for the man who had been hurt trying to save it. He looked up as she knelt in front of him, his face smudged with soot, his eyes clouded with pain. She reached out, her hand hovering over his ruined one, not knowing what to do. "The well," she said, her voice thick with tears. "We need clean water." She helped him to his feet, her arm around his waist, and led him away from the heat and smoke of the fire. She sat him down near the door of the shack and ran to the well, pumping with a strength she did not know she possessed. She brought back a bucket of cold, clean water. Gently, her touch as light as a breath, she began to wash the wound, clearing away the soot and grime. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, but he did not pull away. He let her tend to him. She remembered seeing broad-leafed plants growing near the base of the cliffs, Plants her mother had once called plantain and used for bee stings. She ran, her bare feet stumbling over the rocky ground in the dark, and gathered a handful of the leaves. Back at the shack, she crushed them between two stones, making a green, soothing poultice. She spread it carefully over the worst of the burns, her tears still falling, dripping onto his arm. She needed a bandage. The blanket was filthy, his bedroll too rough. Without a second thought, she gathered the hem of her own skirt, the last good piece of clothing she owned, a link to her old life. With a small knife from the kitchen supplies, she sawed at the fabric, then ripped. The sound of tearing cloth was loud and final in the quiet night. She tore a long, clean strip and began to wrap his hand and arm, her movements deft and sure. He watched her the entire time, his face pale in the pre-dawn light, his breathing shallow. The silence between them had returned, but it had changed its very nature. It was no longer a space of caution and distance, an empty vessel they filled with their separate thoughts. Now, it was a shared space of healing. It was the silence of her gentle touch, of his endured pain, of her tears falling on his skin. In the dark, terrible crucible of the fire, their partnership had been forged into something new, something stronger than steel. She finished tying the knot on the bandage, her hands covering his. The ruin of the stable smoldered behind them, a dark and tragic scar on the land. But in the quiet space between them, a fragile and tenacious hope had been illuminated. The fire changed the rhythm of their days. Cole's left hand, swathed in the clean linen of Eliza's torn skirt, was a constant throbbing reminder of their vulnerability. He could no longer swing an axe or lift a heavy log. The work of survival now fell disproportionately on her shoulders, and she met the task without complaint. She hauled the water, chopped the kindling, and tended the small snares he taught her how to set. She changed his dressing every morning, her touch gentle and efficient as she cleaned the angry burns and applied a fresh poultice. In these quiet moments, his gaze would rest on her, filled with an emotion she could not yet name, a mixture of gratitude and a deep, troubled sorrow. One afternoon, a week after the fire, he watched her struggle to move a large rock from the path to the well. He stood from the log where he had been mending a bridle with his one good hand and walked over to her. "That is enough," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There is something else you need to learn." He led her not to the woodpile or the well, but to the shack. From beneath his cot, he pulled a long, cloth-wrapped object. It was his rifle, a Winchester that had seen hard use but was meticulously cared for. The wood of the stock was dark and smooth, the barrel a dull, deadly blue. "Warren Blackstone will be back," he said, stating a fact as plainly as he would state that the sun would set. "He will not be alone. I cannot protect you if my hand is burned or a bullet finds me first. You need to be able to protect yourself." The weight of the rifle in her hands was a shock. It was heavier than she had imagined, a cold, dense piece of machinery. It smelled of oil and smoke. Fear, a familiar, coiling serpent, stirred in her stomach. A gun was a tool for men like Warren, for the men who had taken her. It was an instrument of power used against the powerless. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice tight. Cole's good hand came to rest on the rifle, not taking it from her, but steadying it. "You can," he said, his voice calm and certain. "Fear is a cage. This is a key. You just have to learn how to turn it." He led her to a narrow canyon a half-mile from the shack, a place of sheer rock walls and deep shadows. He set a tin can on a ledge 50 yards away, a small, glittering speck against the red rock. He showed her how to load the rifle, how to chamber a round, his movements slow and deliberate so she could follow. "Now," he said, positioning himself behind her. The heat of his body was a solid presence at her back. "Plant your feet. Lean into it." He guided her stance, his hand on her shoulder. "It will kick. Let your shoulder take the blow." His right arm came around her, his hand covering hers on the stock. His cheek was close to hers as he helped her sight down the long barrel. She could feel his breath, steady and warm, against her ear. "Breathe out slow," he murmured. "When your lungs are empty, that is when you squeeze. Do not pull, just squeeze." The world narrowed to the front sight, the distant can, and the feeling of his body shielding hers. She let out her breath, the air leaving her in a long, slow sigh. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a violent clap of thunder that slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder and echoed off the canyon walls. The can on the ledge remained untouched. The shot had gone wide, kicking up a puff of red dust a foot to the left. She flinched, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. "Again," he said, his voice calm and patient in her ear. They did it again and again. Each time, the kick of the rifle was a jarring shock, the blast an assault on the quiet. Her shots went wide, high, low. Frustration began to build, a hot, prickly feeling under her skin. She was failing. "You are thinking about the noise," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. "You are thinking about the kick. Do not think, just look. See only the can. Nothing else exists." She took a deep breath, the clean, dry air filling her lungs. She settled the rifle against her shoulder again, feeling the familiar and now comforting pressure of his body behind hers. She looked down the barrel. This time, she saw only the can. A tiny, insignificant object. A target. She let her breath out, squeezed, and the rifle roared. A sharp clang echoed back through the canyon. The can jumped into the air, spinning, and fell to the ground. A dark hole punched through its center. A surprised laugh escaped Eliza's lips. She had done it. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder aching, her ears ringing, but a fierce, triumphant joy was singing through her veins. She turned her head to look at him, a wide, genuine smile spreading across her face. He was already looking at her, and in his gray eyes, she saw not just approval, but a profound sense of relief. In that moment, she had not just learned to shoot. She had taken a piece of her own power back. The key had turned in the lock. Their existence took another turn a few days later. A lone drover, a man with a sun-cracked face and weary eyes, passed through the valley with the dregs of a larger herd. He had 3 cows that were too thin and sore-footed to make the rest of the journey. He offered them to Cole for a price that was little more than theft. Cole paid him from the small stash of coins in his wooden box, and suddenly, they were no longer just survivors. They were ranchers. The cows were scrawny, their ribs showing like washboards, but to Eliza, they were beautiful. They were a beginning, a living, breathing promise of a future. They built a new enclosure, a small corral of woven branches, their 4 hands one strong, one bandaged, 2 determined working together. The lowing of the cattle in the morning was a sound of hope. It was the smoke that led her to the millers, a thin gray tendril rising from a valley 2 miles to the south, a sign of other people in this vast emptiness, driven by a curiosity that was stronger than her caution. She walked toward it one afternoon while Cole was out checking his snares. She found a small homestead, a sod house dug into the side of a hill, looking more like a part of the earth than a dwelling. A woman was outside, hanging laundry, her movements slow and tired. A small boy of about 7 was playing in the dirt with a stick. The woman, May Miller, was wary at first, but Eliza's open face and the offering of a small bundle of mullein leaves for tea soon softened her. May had a deep, racking cough that shook her thin frame, and she was grateful for the remedy. While they talked, the boy, Tommy, watched Eliza with wide, curious eyes. Eliza found herself smiling, a genuine, easy expression she had not felt in years. She sat in the dirt with Tommy and showed him how to make numbers with colored pebbles. From a ridge overlooking the homestead, Cole watched. He had followed her, worried, staying far enough back not to be seen. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, her head bent close to the boy's, her face transformed. The hard lines of fear and survival were gone, replaced by a softness, a gentle light that seemed to radiate from within. He was watching a woman he had never seen before, and the sight caused a painful tightening in his chest. He had brought her to this hard life, this life of hiding and fear. Seeing her like this, so full of life and warmth, he knew with a terrible certainty that he was the cage that now held her. That evening, the mood in the shack was different. A tension hummed in the air. Cole was even quieter than usual, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. After their meal, as Eliza was banking the fire for the night, he finally spoke. "I met a man today," he said, his voice low. "A freight driver, heading east toward the Staked Plain. He will pass this way again in 2 days. Eliza looked at him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach, and, "He is a good man, for a price. He will take a passenger. He would see you safely to a town with a stagecoach. From there, you could go anywhere. Start fresh, where no one knows your name. No one has a piece of paper that says they own you." He would not look at her. He stared into the glowing embers, his one good hand clenched into a fist on his knee. The world seemed to fall away. Eliza could hear the blood pounding in her ears. He was sending her away. After all of this, after the fire, after the shooting lessons, after the cows, he was telling her to leave. He was doing it for her. She knew that. He was trying to give her freedom, but it felt like an eviction. She stood up and walked over to him, standing before him, so he was forced to look up at her. His face in the firelight was a mask of anguish. "Is that what you want, Cole?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you want me to go?" "What I want does not matter," he said, his voice rough. "Warren Blackstone has the law on his side. He has money and men. I have one good hand and a rifle. I brought this trouble to you. I cannot keep you safe here." "You think safety is a place?" she asked, a new strength hardening her voice. "I lived in a safe house my entire life. It had strong walls and locked doors, and it was a prison. I have not been safe since I was a girl, but I have been free for the first time these past weeks. Here, with you." She knelt in front of him, taking his good hand in hers. "You did not bring this trouble to me. It followed me here, and I will not run from it again. I am not that girl anymore." She looked around the small, rough room, at the stone hearth she had swept, at the cot he slept in, at the rifle leaning against the wall. "I am here because I chose to be here," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of a tremor. "This is already my home." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was replaced by a dawning wonder. He saw not the frightened girl he had rescued, but the strong woman who was now rescuing him from his own guilt. A slow, difficult smile touched his lips. He lifted his hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The next morning, they began to build a fence. It was not a corral for the cattle. They started near the shack, digging post holes in the hard, rocky ground. It was back-breaking work. Cole used his good arm and his shoulder to drive the digging bar into the earth, while Eliza cleared the loosened rock and dirt with her hands. Together, they set the posts, thick lengths of juniper they had dragged down from the high country. It was a slow, arduous process, but with each post they set, a line was being drawn. It was a line that defined their space, a boundary between the world that had tried to claim them and the small piece of it they were now claiming for themselves. It was not just a fence of wood and stone. It was a fence of choice, of shared labor, a visible declaration of their intent to stand their ground, together. The sky had been promising rain for days, hanging low and heavy, the color of a dull pewter bowl. When it finally came, it was not the violent, flash-flooding deluge of before, but a slow, weeping gray that settled over the valley and refused to leave. It rained through the day and into the night, a steady, relentless drumming that found every weakness in their small world. The first drip landed on Eliza's cheek as she slept, a cold, startling tear from the ceiling. Soon, another followed, and then another. By midnight, the roof of the shack was a sieve, the steady drip, 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 a maddening chorus in the dark. Their blankets were soaked, the floor was a patchwork of puddles, and the hearth fire hissed and sputtered in protest. Cole, his face grim in the faint, dying light of the fire, made a decision. We cannot stay in here. We will be soaked to the bone by morning. He pointed toward the door, the woodshed. It was not much more than a lean-to, a three-sided structure where they kept the firewood stacked and dry. But its roof, made of thick, overlapping juniper boughs, was far more watertight than the shack's. They moved what they could, the sheepskin, the one dry blanket, the rifle, and a handful of wood to start a small fire just inside the opening, sheltered from the downpour. The space was tiny, barely big enough for two people and a small fire. They sat on the sheepskin, their backs against the rough-hewn wall, sharing the blanket over their shoulders. Outside, the rain fell in a solid, gray curtain, enclosing them in their small, flickering world. The air smelled of wet earth, pine sap, and wood smoke. For a long time, they just listened to the rain, the silence between them no longer a space to be filled, but a presence in itself, as real as the firelight dancing on their faces. It was Eliza who spoke first, her voice soft, barely more than a whisper against the sound of the storm. What was your home like before all this? Cole stared into the crackling flames, the light carving shadows into the lean planes of his face. He was quiet for so long she thought he had not heard her. When he finally answered, his voice was a low rumble, dredged up from a deep and quiet place. It was not one place. He said, it was a series of places. My father was a man who was always looking for better land, just over the next rise. We never stayed long enough to put down deep roots. He shifted, the movement causing the bandage on his hand to stand out starkly white in the firelight. But I had a younger brother, Silas. He was all sharp angles and quick laughter. The world was a constant surprise to him. He paused, and Eliza could feel the weight of the memory settling in the small space. There was a winter that forgot to end. The snows came early and stayed late. What little we had ran out. My father went looking for work, for food. He did not come back. My mother, she just got quieter and smaller every day. Silas, he stopped laughing. Hunger is a quiet thief. It steals your voice first, then your strength, then your hope. He picked up a small twig and pushed it into the edge of the fire, watching it curl and blacken. He died in the spring, just as the first green shoots were pushing through the snow. I always thought, if we could have just held on for one more week. He fell silent, but the story hung in the air, a ghost of a hungry boy and a brother left behind. Eliza felt a profound ache in her chest, not of pity, but of a shared and terrible understanding of loss. She knew what it was to be powerless, to have the world shrink to a single, desperate hope. I'm so sorry, Cole, she whispered. He shook his head, not in denial, but as if to clear it. It was a long time ago. He finally turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes dark with old sorrows. What about you, the time you were gone? It was her turn to look into the fire. She had never spoken of it to anyone. Her parents had treated it as a shameful sickness to be hidden away. But here, in this small, rain-swept shelter, the truth felt possible. It was not the fear I remember most, she began, her voice low and even. Although I was afraid, it was the talking, the way they talked about me when they thought I could not hear. She wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling the blanket tighter. They were arguing about my father, about money he owed them, and they talked about me like I was a deed to a piece of land, what my value was, how much he would pay to get me back. They put a price on me. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face in the flickering light. Do you know what that feels like, to be reduced to a number in a ledger, to have your entire being, your life, weighed against a stack of coins? Warren Blackstone, My father, they did the same thing on that platform. They were just using prettier words. They were all just bidding. Cole's face was unreadable, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He had not just rescued her from a forced marriage. He had rescued her from an auction block she had been on her whole life. The fire was beginning to die down, the small pile of wood they had brought in dwindling to glowing coals. A deep, wet chill began to creep into the shed. Eliza shivered, pulling the blanket tighter, but it was not enough. Cole, with only one good hand, could not easily get more wood from the stack without letting the rain in. "Come here," Eliza said softly. It was an impulse, born of a simple, practical need for warmth. She shifted on the sheepskin, making a space. "The fire is almost out. We will freeze if we sit apart." He looked at her. Then at the small space she had made, he hesitated for a second before moving closer, their shoulders and hips pressing together. It was better, but the cold was persistent. "This is foolish," Eliza murmured, a new boldness in her voice. She turned to face him. "There is room for two if we do not mind the squeeze." Before he could protest, she moved, shifting so she was sitting on his lap, her back against his chest, pulling the shared blanket up to their chins. He was a solid, living wall of warmth behind her. His body went rigid with surprise. He was not a man accustomed to being touched. And then he let out a low groan, a sound of protest that was half exhaustion and half something else. He shifted his injured left arm, which was now pinned awkwardly between them. She sat on his lap. He groaned, the words a low, weary rumble against her ear. "Darlin, you'll break me before the sun rises." The unexpected jest, the dry wit in the face of their grim reality, broke through the tension like a ray of sun. A surprised laugh bubbled up out of Eliza, a real, unfettered sound of mirth. The sound of it seemed to startle him, and then a slow, low chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound she felt as much as heard. They were two people huddled in a leaking shed, with enemies who would see them dead or broken, and they were laughing. When the laughter subsided, a new, warmer silence settled. The chill was gone, chased away not just by their shared body heat, but by the moment of grace they had just shared. Eliza leaned her head back against his shoulder. He did not stiffen this time. His body relaxed, accepting her weight, her presence. Slowly, she turned her head. His face was only inches from hers. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft, red glow. His eyes, fixed on hers, were no longer guarded. They were open, filled with a raw and vulnerable light. He did not move. The invitation had to be hers. And so, with a courage that came from a place deeper than shooting a rifle or facing down an enemy, she leaned in and touched her lips to his. It was not a kiss of fire or passion. It was a kiss of quiet acknowledgement, as soft and as steady as the rain falling outside. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the faint, salty tang of her own tears, shed for his long-lost brother. It was a promise made without words, a treaty signed in the heart of the storm. When she pulled back, he lifted his good hand and gently touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. No words were spoken. None were needed. They fell asleep like that, huddled together in the dark, wrapped in a single blanket. The rain continued to fall, washing the world clean, and for the first time their small, shared shelter felt less like a hideout and more like the foundation of a home. They were partners now, forged not by a preacher's words but in the quiet crucible of a rainy night. The peace that followed the rain was a fragile, precious thing. The world seemed washed clean, the air crisp, and the new fence posts stood like sentinels guarding their small patch of hope. It was a time of quiet work and shared glances, of a partnership that had found its voice in the heart of a storm. But they both knew it was a borrowed peace, a quiet breath taken before the real storm broke. It broke on a cloudless afternoon. The sun was high and hot. beating down on the valley. Cole was reinforcing the new corral, his bandaged hand still an impediment, while Eliza was weeding the small patch of ground she had hopefully designated as a garden. She saw them first, a group of riders silhouetted against the bright sky at the mouth of the valley. It was more than last time. 5 of them. Her heart did not leap with fear. Instead, a cold, heavy certainty settled in her stomach. She straightened up, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her skirt. "Cole," she said, her voice quiet but carrying. He had seen them too. He set down his hammer, his movements calm and economical. He walked to the shack, and when he came back out, he was carrying the Winchester. He did not take it for himself. He handed it to her. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, a universe of understanding passed between them. He trusted her. She took the rifle, its weight familiar and reassuring now. Cole moved to stand beside her, unarmed, his one good hand resting on the top rail of the new fence. He was presenting himself as a target, drawing their fire. But his stance was not one of submission. It was one of ownership. This was his ground. They stood together and waited as the riders approached. Her father was in the lead. Silas Hart sat tall on his big bay horse, his face set like granite. Beside him, looking smug and out of place in a city suit, was Warren Blackstone. Deputy Harlan Pike was there, his badge catching the sun, and 2 other men Eliza recognized as Blackstone's hired guns. Tailing them all was a small, weasel-faced man in a dusty bowler hat, clutching a leather satchel. This must be the lawyer. They stopped a few yards from the fence line, a formidable assembly of money, law, and force. It was her father who spoke first, his voice the one she remembered from childhood, the voice of absolute authority. "Eliza, this farce is over. You will come with us now." The small man with a satchel dismounted and stepped forward, opening his bag. "Silas Hart," he began, his voice thin and reedy, as the legally recognized guardian of Eliza Hart, a ward of the territory declared mentally infirm due to past traumas. "You are within your rights to reclaim your property." He said the word with a dry, precise finality that made Eliza's skin crawl. She felt Cole tense beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But before he could speak, Eliza stepped forward, the rifle held loosely in her arms, its barrel pointed at the ground. She did not raise it as a threat. She held it as a statement. She looked past the lawyer, past the sneering face of Warren Blackstone, and met her father's hard eyes. "I am not your property." "Father," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced them all. "I am not a parcel of land to be traded. I am not a column in a ledger. I am your daughter." She took another step, her boots firm in the red dirt she now called home. "I am not infirm. I have never seen things more clearly in my life. I choose this house. I choose this land." She turned her head and looked at the man standing beside her, his face a mask of fierce pride. "And I choose the man who walked through fire for me." A stunned silence followed her declaration. Silas Hart's face darkened with a rage that was terrifying to behold. Warren Blackstone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Brave words from a frightened girl playing with a man's weapon," Warren sneered. "Pike, arrest him. The warrant is for kidnapping." Deputy Pike, emboldened by his numbers, swung down from his horse, his hand on his pistol. "You heard him. Ashford, you are coming with me." "He is going nowhere," Eliza said, and this time she shifted the rifle in her hands, the movement slight but full of meaning. "Put that thing down before you hurt yourself, girl," Pike snarled. The standoff was absolute, a brittle, humming tension that could snap at any moment. But the world is wider than a single valley, and news travels on the wind. From the trail that led to the Miller homestead, a new sound emerged, the rattle of a wagon. Inez, the owner of the Dustpan Saloon, sat on the wagon seat, holding the reins. Beside her sat May Miller, her face pale but determined. And in the back, holding onto the sides, were two homesteaders Eliza recognized from town. They had come. Inez pulled the wagon to a halt a short distance away, creating a new flank, a new line in the battle. "Having some trouble?" "Deputy," she called out, her voice laced with amusement. "This is official business. Inez," Pike snapped. "Stay out of it." "Does not look official to me," Inez retorted, crossing her arms. "Looks like a bunch of rich men trying to bully a girl who had the good sense to walk away from a bad bargain. We were in town. We saw it. Warren here says this man kidnapped her. But me and Jed and Martha here," she gestured to the others, "we all saw Miss Hart walk away from that ridiculous stage show all on her own. Looked to me like she was the one doing the choosing." The lawyer, Finch, sputtered. Eyewitness testimony is irrelevant in the face of a legal guardianship writ. His words were cut off by a sudden change in the air. The relentless sun seemed to dim, as if a shade had been pulled across the sky. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly picked up, moaning through the canyon rocks. To the west, the horizon had disappeared. In its place was a solid, churning wall of red, a monstrous wave of dust and dirt rising 1,000 feet into the air. "Dust storm," Cole said, his voice a low warning. "A bad one." The homesteaders in the wagon knew the danger. They began to shout, trying to turn the wagon around. The horses, smelling the storm, began to rear and pull at their reins, their eyes rolling. The world descended into chaos. The wind hit them like a physical blow, stealing their breath and blinding them with a gritty, stinging curtain of red dust. Eliza could hear her father shouting her name, his voice swallowed by the roar of the wind. She could see shapes moving through the swirling haze, men fighting to control their panicked horses. The sun was gone, blotted out completely. The world was a screaming, suffocating twilight. "Tommy," it was May Miller's voice, a thin shriek of pure terror, cutting through the gale. "My boy, he was following the wagon. Where is he?" In the confusion, in the sudden, violent arrival of nature's fury, the legal documents and pistols and threats were rendered meaningless. There was only one thing that mattered now, a lost child in the heart of a storm. "The washout!" Cole yelled in Eliza's ear, his voice barely audible over the wind. The rain cut a new one. He could have fallen in. Without another word, they moved. They were no longer two separate people. They were a single unit, acting with one mind. They tied a rope from the wagon around Eliza's waist, and Cole held the other end, his feet braced against the ground. He was her anchor. She still held the rifle. They stumbled through the blinding dust, leaning into the wind, calling the boy's name. The world was a churning chaos of red grit and screaming wind. They could barely see 5 feet in front of them. Then they heard a faint cry, nearly stolen by the storm. They followed the sound to the edge of a deep, newly carved gully, a raw wound in the earth where the last rains had torn the soil away. And at the bottom, 10 feet down, was Tommy. His small face streaked with dirt and tears, his ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. There was no time for discussion. Cole braced himself, his boots digging into the loose soil at the edge of the chasm. "I will lower you," he yelled. Eliza did not hesitate. She handed him the rifle and, clutching the rope, began to rappel down the steep, crumbling side of the gully. Loose dirt and rocks rained down around her as she went. She reached the bottom and scrambled to the crying boy's side. "It is all right, Tommy," she said, her voice a calm anchor in his storm of fear. "We are here now." His ankle was clearly broken. She looked up. The wind howled over the edge of the gully, sending down showers of dirt. She could see the faces peering down, hazy figures in the red gloom. Her father, Pike, Inez, May. They were all just spectators now. She fashioned a makeshift splint from the boy's own walking stick and a strip of cloth torn from her sleeve. Then she looked up at Cole. "Pull!" she shouted. He could not pull them both up with one good hand. But her father was there, Silas Hart, his face a mask of awe and disbelief, moved to Cole's side and took hold of the rope. Together, the two men, the rancher and the cowboy, began to haul. Eliza held the small boy tight against her chest, and they were lifted out of the darkness, up into the screaming red heart of the storm. When they reached the top, May Miller rushed forward and gathered her son into her arms, her sobs lost in the wind. Eliza stood, catching her breath, covered in dirt, her hair wild. She looked at the faces around her. Inez was smiling, a look of fierce pride on her face. Warren Blackstone was staring at her as if he had never seen her before. And her father. Silas Hart was looking at his daughter, not as a piece of property, but as a woman of incredible courage and competence. He saw the woman who had faced down his authority, calmed a frightened child, and descended into a chasm without a moment's hesitation. The image of his fragile, infirm daughter, the narrative he had clung to, had been shattered, blown away by the wind. The fury of the storm began to lessen. The wind subsided, and the thick red curtain began to thin, revealing the world again. The threat was over. Silas Hart looked from his daughter to the exhausted but steady man at her side. He looked at the grateful face of May Miller and the watching eyes of the other homesteaders. He looked at the useless legal document that Finch was still clutching, now covered in a film of red dust. It was just a piece of paper. It held no power here. The truth was standing right in front of him, undeniable and solid as the earth itself. He turned without a word and walked to his horse. He mounted, his movements heavy, the movements of a defeated man. "Where are you going?" Warren demanded, his voice shrill. "We are not finished here." Silas Hart looked down at the younger man, and for the first time, there was no alliance in his eyes, only a deep, weary contempt. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "We are." He pulled his horse's head around and rode away, not looking back. The lawyer, Finch, scrambled to gather his things and scurried after him. Warren stood for a moment, his face a mask of impotent fury, before he and his hired men followed. Their retreat a stark admission of their utter and complete failure. Their power, built on paper and threats, had crumbled to dust. A year is a lifetime in the Arizona Territory. It is long enough for a raw wound in the earth to soften at the edges, for a fence line to settle into the landscape as if it had always been there, and for two strangers to build a home out of silence and labor. The sun and the seasons had turned the page, and the story of Cole and Eliza was now written not in dust and fear, but in the solid posts of their fence, the contented clucking of a half-dozen chickens, and the slow, steady rhythm of their lives. Their herd had grown. The 3 scrawny cows they had bought were now sleek and healthy, and one had given birth to a sturdy bull calf in the spring. The calf was their first real profit, the first tangible proof that a future could be built here. It was time to sell him. It was time to go back to Red Mesa. They set out at dawn, the air cool and tasting of sage. Eliza rode the roan, and Cole walked beside her, leading the calf on a rope. His left hand was no longer bandaged. The burns had healed into a map of silvery scars, a permanent testament to the night of the fire. He had full use of it again, a fact that was a quiet miracle of Eliza's patient care. They did not speak much on the journey. They did not need to. They moved together with the easy, unspoken understanding of a long-married couple, their quiet punctuated by the soft lowing of the calf and the creak of saddle leather. They were not fugitives returning to the scene of a crime. They were ranchers, bringing their goods to market. As they approached the town, Eliza felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, the ghost of an old fear. Red Mesa looked the same, a single dusty street baking under the relentless sun. But she was not the same. She sat taller in the saddle, her gaze steady. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they walked the roan and the calf down the main street, a silence fell. The blacksmith stopped his hammering, the clang of steel on the steel dying with a final, echoing ring. Men lounging on the porch of the general store slowly stood up, their conversations trailing off. Faces appeared in the windows of the saloon and the bank. They were a spectacle once again. But this time, the terms were different. They were not a scandal. They were a curiosity, a legend that had walked out of the wilderness and back into the light of day. Eliza saw them, scattered along the street like forgotten chess pieces. The suitors, Jedediah Ingram, the rancher's son, stood with his hands on his hips, his chest no longer puffed with arrogance. He simply watched them pass, a look of grudging respect on his face. The clerk from the land office scurried out of their path, his gaze fixed on the dirt as if he were afraid to look up. And then she saw Warren Blackstone. He was stepping out of the bank, his clothes as immaculate as ever, but something in his posture had changed. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by a brittle stiffness. His eyes met Eliza's for a fleeting second, and in them, she saw not hatred, but the dull, bitter ash of defeat. He turned abruptly and went back inside, disappearing into the shadows of his father's wealth. Inez was in her usual place, leaning against the doorframe of the dustpan, a knowing smile on her lips. As they passed, she pushed herself off the wall and spoke, her voice carrying across the quiet street for all to hear. "Well, look at that," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Looks like she picked the right horse after all." A few of the men on the porch chuckled, and the tension that had gripped the town finally broke. People went back to their business. The story had found its ending. They sold the calf for a good price, the rancher who bought him admiring his strong legs and clear eyes. With the coins heavy in a small leather pouch, they bought supplies, a new sack of flour, coffee, salt, and a bolt of sturdy blue cloth for a new dress for Eliza and a shirt for Cole. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the street, they prepared for the ride home. Before they mounted up, Cole stopped her, his expression serious. "Wait," he said. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled something out. He held it in the palm of his scarred hand. It was a ring, simple and unadorned, carved from the pale, smooth wood of a cottonwood tree. It was not perfect. She could see the tiny marks of his knife, the patient, loving labor of 100 quiet evenings. It was more beautiful than any pearl or diamond she had ever seen. He did not kneel. He did not make a grand speech filled with promises he might not be able to keep. He just looked at her, his heart in his gray eyes. "I am not a man of words." "Eliza," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I cannot offer you riches or an easy life. All I have is my labor and my word. This is not a promise of what we will have. It is a promise of what we will be, together." He took her left hand, the one with the calluses on the palm, and slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a deep and profound joy. She looked at the ring, then at the man who had given it to her. She curled her fingers around his, her small, strong hand fitting into his. She did not just say yes. She turned and, holding his hand tightly, led him into the very center of the town square, the dusty patch of ground where she had once been put on display. She stopped and turned to face him, the eyes of the town on them, but she did not see them. She only saw him. "I chose right," she said, her voice clear and strong. A declaration not just for him, but for herself and for the whole world. They rode home as the sun set, painting the mesas in shades of rose and gold. The sky above was vast and full of stars, and the land was still hard and unforgiving. The work would still be there in the morning, the heat, the dust, the constant struggle to pull a life from the dry earth. But they had their freedom, a boundary marked by a fence they had built together. They had a home, a hearth that held the memory of a shared fire on a rainy night. And they had each other, two solitary people who had found their true north in the heart of the wilderness. It was not a perfect ending, but it was a real one, and it was enough. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below to connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.